Hi there, everyone. It's 101 on the West Coast. Good afternoon. Welcome to the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break. I'm Naj Edgar, ACSA Senior Director of Marketing and Communications. To my right, Edgar Zazweta, ACSA's Senior Director of Policy and Governmental Relations. Edgar, good to see you again on a Wednesday. How are you?
This is becoming a thing. I don't mind. Good seeing you every week here for lunch.
And you know what? We love to have our viewers. Again, this is live and interactive, so we say hello to all of our loyal viewers out there. We welcome your questions and your comments throughout the show. We've got a really stacked show for you today. We've got legislative insiders who are going to be coming up in a couple of minutes to talk specifically about distance learning, the impact on the budget, and how school districts move forward as we move forward towards the start of the regular school year. But Edgar, we do have a little bit of information that's just coming out of the governor's noon news conference, and that is specific to an increase in hospitalizations here in the state, masks, congregations, especially over the July 4th holiday. One statistic that really, I don't know if I want to say alarm, because I guess that we should have had the expectation as more facilities were beginning to open. Hospitalizations here in California due to COVID-19 are up 51% in the last couple of weeks. And I won't use this as that opportunity to politically grandstand, but if we want to open schools safely, if we want to get the economy going again, folks, I cannot stress enough to wear a mask. Folks, come on, it's common sense, right?
Absolutely, Naj. I mean, I just reflect back on the conversations we've been having over the last number of weeks, whether it be last week talking about sports and the importance of bringing back those type of activities for our kids, where we're talking about all these different impacts to the budget, thinking about the economy and what is within our control. And to your point, this is within our control. The simple things that just seem like common sense, and maybe we just our society making some generalizations, but in many aspects taking somewhat for granted, is wearing that face covering, doing that physical distancing. As you alluded to, the governor just is in his daily press conference talking about using that dimmer switch, this analogy that we were going pretty fast to open things up. And I think we all took a collective sigh of relief that things may have not been normal, but at least we got a few of those things back. But I know now across the state, some of that is going to get curtailed. I mean, here in Sacramento, we're talking about restaurants not being able to open at full capacity, in-service dining, museums, zoos, things that obviously impact our kids, but I think the most important for our viewers here, and I think it's the number one piece that we've spent the last 4 months talking about. If we don't get a hold of this, it really puts in jeopardy our ability to get our kids back on campuses. And I think that prime and simple, that's what we have before us. And I think us doing our part, and I think the governor and the state are pushing this so hard as we enter 4th of July weekend. And I actually appreciated the analogy that on this 4th of July, there's a different way to be patriotic, right? And the way to be patriotic is maybe not do the big barbecue, not gather in big groups. And going back to this, just doing the simple thing of wearing the face covering, wearing the mask.
Yeah, so. I am greatly concerned about what the statistics are going to look like following the July 4th holiday weekend, if indeed people are not respecting the recommendations about public gatherings and about wearing masks. It's definitely a concern. And of course, for all of our education leaders out there, I mean, we want to safely reopen schools. We want to get the students back into the classroom. But the more growth that we see with COVID-19, the more widespread we get. There's a concern. Hey, folks, I do want to remind you again, we're live and interactive, so we welcome your questions and your comments today. We're going to talk about distance learning because we talked about sports last week. We had a great show, so much interaction, Edgar. But now we're talking about distance learning because now we're starting to have school districts take their reopening plans to the school board, and that means they're showing their models, whether it's all in person, whether it's all distance learning, or it's a hybrid model. And this is something that's happening statewide.
Yeah, this is where now it becomes real, right? We were talking about our reopening guidelines, our plans. Now this is being put into action. I think this piece that we'll hear from our experts was one of the final variables that folks needed to know what was going to be in place so folks can finalize their plans. And we're seeing that across the state now. How to put those guidelines now into place. And then I think at the center of this has been whether it be as one component, or hopefully this is not the case, but if we go back into a situation where schools have to close on a broader scale or an individual county, this distance learning component, there's obviously been a ton of attention. And I think the point of us bringing this topic this week is because we've seen there's been a lot of questions, but also because I think the intent is for it to look somewhat different than maybe it did in the spring. And we'll hear from our guest on those subjects.
Well, you mentioned guests, so let's go ahead and bring in our guests right now. We brought in some insiders for you on the topic of distance learning. Erin Gabel is from the Assembly Budget Committee, and Jessica Holmes is the Assistant Program Budget Manager, K-12 Early Education from Finance. Thank you guys so much for being with us today here on the Legislative Lunch Break. Let me throw this question out first because I think it's important. Thinking back to March and April, when the pandemic was becoming far more serious, and it was becoming more serious, of course, right in the middle of the budget process. How did the mindset of the Newsom administration and the legislature change when it came to shaping priorities?
So I would say completely. It wasn't quite overnight, but in retrospect, it felt a little bit overnight. Prior to COVID-19, we had been talking about fully funding LCFF with COLA. And all of a sudden, we were talking about massively plummeting revenues and the need for reductions in LCFF. So I think from a programmatic perspective too, we'd been talking about special education reform, which is still moving forward, but we'd been talking about ways that we could really put some measures into place to improve student outcomes. And then suddenly we were talking about really getting back down to basics of health and safety and trying to mitigate the loss of learning for all of our students. So it really changed the conversation.
If you think about just the difference that happened between the passage of SB 117 and the commitment to fully funding schools during the chaos, when we passed that legislation, the legislature never even imagined that we wouldn't come back in this school year, let alone not be coming back until the fall. And so things were changing at such a quick pace at both the state level and at the local level. And I think you see a lot, just as Jessica said, a lot of the values that were debated and folks were interested in January carrying through into the final Budget Act, but in a very, very different prioritized context.
We've gone a long way, obviously, since May. And when the governor came out with his May revision, I mean, now all the headlines was this huge budget deficit, right, that we had, and the numbers were pretty staggering. And we had a lot of conversations of what the impact was going to be to schools, and we're going to see some drastic cuts. I guess this question for Erin. None of the people that you helped support there in the legislature, none of them sought office to make cuts. Obviously, all of them want to seek office to do things, to use these resources to make our state a better place. And I think we acknowledge that at least on the education side, we were able to avoid some of those drastic cuts. But we also get that there was limited amount of revenue. So given that school funding was generally stable there, what did that come at the expense of? Like, what were some of the sacrifices the state had to make in order to make this a reality?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question, because I think that we all live in our budget silos. I think we all track those issues that are affecting us day to day and our own bottom lines. And we heard a lot of concern from leadership from education systems that they weren't seeing enough funding for education. And I think we can all agree we were not adequately funding education in California prior to the pandemic. And we knew we were asking for an enormous task from school leadership to reopen safely as a priority for all of our students. And you saw that value first off in the May revise. And I think it's really, really important for folks to realize that while there were cuts and there were recommendations around some hard choices in the May revise that we ended up being able to mitigate in the final Budget Act, we saw from the very beginning this commitment from the administration that what scarce resources we had one time from the federal government, that schools were a priority with 100% discretionary funding. And that was absolutely crucial in us being able to come to the final budget compromise that we did, that put schools first, that put schools as a first responder for our students and for our economy in the way that we're all hoping to see happen this year. And with the resources that could have gone to public health infrastructure, that could have gone to our elderly populations who are suffering, that could have gone to corrections reform, where we're seeing incredibly high caseload of COVID infection. There are a lot of populations that are being directly impacted by this pandemic and by this crisis, and there had to be choices made around priority, and this budget put our kids first.
Jessica, let me ask you, everyone jumped into distance learning with little notice this spring. So, we had the expectations, but everybody had to pivot so quickly. From the policy standpoint, what did we learn as a state? And how did that impact some of the final agreements that we made as we came towards the end of this budget process?
Well, we learned that some LEAs were very ready for a distance learning model, and some really weren't. And that's not to cast aspersions on anyone, because I don't think any of us anticipated something like this happening. But the application of a distance learning model was extremely uneven across the state. And I think that one fact alone was really the crucial point that we all discussed when we were coming to the final budget deal. I know Erin and our colleagues in the Senate, we had long discussions about how do we both allow for the flexibility that's necessary and the stability in funding for schools who are doing a great job with distance learning to continue to do it right, but at the same time recognize that there are some that really struggle. And there are some where there are some outcomes for some of our kids that are really unacceptable. And how do we ensure that there's a level of accountability built in as well with that flexibility to ensure that our kids are not being lost through, falling through the cracks essentially. And so that balance of flexibility to ensure health and safety and to allow kids to be served while trying to maintain a level of expectation and quality in the education that's being provided to especially our most vulnerable kids. That was the real long conversation that we all had around the ADA hold harmless and the distance learning model moving forward.
Erin, on this piece, in doing our advocacy, we were talking to a lot of legislators, and one interesting piece that came up, that's the public sometimes doesn't see this part, that the legislators, the policymakers, oftentimes are parents themselves, right? They're consumers of the system. And some kind of the anecdotal evidence that we got there, or the conversation, was that those that had kids in the system kind of had some concerns. How do you think that impacted kind of the policy development process, especially from the legislative side, in terms of what we saw in the final product?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think that we were all really encouraged and surprised when we realized just how much of our caucus conversations in both the Senate and the Assembly was dedicated to concern about what was happening in our education systems, and because of the amount of parents that we have currently in an elected office. So, it certainly was probably, I would say, the first, the second, and then the fourth conversation in every single caucus meeting was about what's going to happen with the schools. When are we going to safely reopen? When are children going to get equal access to what they need in order to learn and to grow and to be able to have mitigations against trauma during this time? I think that one of the underlying conversations you heard over and over again from elected officials, including our budget chair and our subcommittee chair, who are both public school parents and distance learning teachers, so to speak, during the spring, was this concern that our kids, quote unquote, our kids, meaning those who were in this conversation as elected officials, were some of the most privileged children in the state who had access to incredible amounts of online support and counseling and all kinds of different things to mitigate the fear and the stress of this time, not to mention the potential for learning loss. And so that conversation started very quickly, right at the time of May Revise, of what can we do to ensure that all children in California are receiving the very best support that we can during this time? How do we pivot as quickly as possible for all of our children? And that was a conversation we heard over and over again.
Jessica, you've been bombarded by our questions here in the last week, and I know you've been hearing from our members, from folks like us who represent numerous associations, and there's been a lot of questions about, one, what are kind of the responsibilities of schools or districts or the LEA, and then also questions about the rights of the parent under distance learning. So can you maybe we start there, just big picture, what are some of those responsibilities that now a school or school district has? And then we get to this question about what rights as a parent, if they don't want to send their kid back to school, what's at their disposal there?
Certainly. So there are two main lenses that we as the state would like local educational agencies to see this point in time through. And then some steps we think would be, helpful in terms of understanding how to move forward. So I think the first piece that we want to make sure that LEAs are thinking about is the health and safety of their students. I know we've got a lot of questions about whether or not that particular statement means that schools have to get sign off from their local health officers in order to offer a certain instructional model. And no, that's not the case. But what we are wanting folks to do is, we have statewide health guidance for healthy schools during COVID-19. And there may be local guidance that may be more strict depending on the situation. And we'd like our school leaders to take a look at those pieces of guidance when making decisions about how they're coming back into school. So health and safety is really key, and especially recognizing the fluid nature of the COVID-19 pandemic. As the governor mentioned today, there will be closing indoor service in restaurants, and that's very different from where we were yesterday. So it continues to develop. So that's the first piece. The second piece is we understand that the small amount of data that we've been able to gather and over these last few months have really pointed to these huge importance of in-classroom instruction, in-person instruction for our children in this state. And so to the greatest extent possible, the statute that's been enacted along with this budget has the expectation that schools will be offering in-classroom instruction to the greatest extent possible. So that's the second lens that we are wanting school leaders to look at this reopening through. But we understand that there's quite a bit of concern from parents, and part of the LCAP process is this strong system of community engagement that we expect LEAs to be participating in. And with the COVID-19 pandemic, that's even more important. And we know that many schools, many school districts, many leaders have been reaching out to their communities and finding out what's important to their parents and what their parents want. And really what it looks like in terms of what we're seeing as schools and districts present their reopening models is a lot are offering multiple options to families. And that is really in reflection of the fact that different parents want different things for their kids. And that's all allowable within the current framework of the budget. I just want to point out, though, the one very important thing that these options for learning outside of the classroom really should be done through the lens of health and safety. So I've gotten a lot of questions around, can we just offer distance learning for right now? It's not required, for health and safety, but we just we just want to make sure that we're ready, in case we have to close for in-classroom instruction. And really, that's not what the state is saying. The state is saying, offer the in-classroom instruction. For the families that want it, they can access it. If you need to do some other kind of model to allow for health and safety, then that's great too. But that's really the message that we're trying to get across, which is always a difficult thing to do when you have a nuanced message like that during a pandemic. But that is what we're trying to have a unified voice on from the state.
All right, and we want to remind all of you to join us with your questions and your comments. David Kay and Corey Brown both have two really good questions. And guys, do us a favor and hang on, because we'll have our panelists come and answer those questions in just a moment. So stick with us and invite your friends too to stick with us as well. Erin, I'm going to ask you this next question. For districts that right now feel compelled to go 100% distance learning on day one of the school year, what's the state's message to them, and what is legal under SB 98?
So I think, to reiterate the point that Jessica was making, is that we are hoping that what is compelling school districts to make that choice is the clear guidance of the public health officials, not any other kind of deciding factor. We want in-person, safe, supportive instruction to be the very first default for our schools. It was important for us to create all kinds of flexibility within that framework, as you'll see in the legislation, whether that be based off of a personal need to quarantine or the need for distance learning for vulnerable populations, whether that was the flexibility for it to be a school-based decision or an LEA-wide decision. We tried to provide a lot of flexibility, but we did not want politics or pressure or a lack of information to be what's driving the decisions about what's best for our kids' safety and health, and wanted that to be in the hands of the public health officers. We know that LEAs have been working incredibly hard in partnership with their public health officers to make very hard decisions in a historic environment, and we want that to continue to be the driver of what compels one model over another during this time. So that being said, for a school district working in partnership or a charter school working in partnership with their public health officer, and it becomes clear that only 100% distance learning is going to be something that is safe and conducive to the learning of their students, that is what they're going to need to do. And we worked very hard with the administration to create some minimum standards that we hope to see happen in a distance learning environment in this next school year in order to be able to address the inconsistencies that we saw this last spring.
Jessica, our members have been asking a lot of questions about attendance, and one of our viewers had a similar question. How do we enforce attendance when students have unexcused absences during distance learning? So kind of what's the thought process there in terms of accounting for students and whether they're there on a daily basis?
Certainly. So I can speak to the statutory framework around this. And then I would note that the Department of Education will have guidance regarding how attendance and apportionment will be happening during the next year, coming out very shortly. So we kept all of the attendance, the compulsory attendance requirements in statute that are currently there. So things like the SARB process, that's still in the statutory framework that we have. However, we do have some new requirements that need to be spelled out within the substitute for the LCAP that was due on July 1, or normally in a normal year would have been due on July 1 of this year today. That is going to be changed a little bit to reflect the need for federal reporting requirements, but will reflect a good amount of what's normally in the LCAP, and that's called the Learning Continuity and Attendance Plan, and that's going to be due at the end of September. But that requires that school districts describe how they are intending to re-engage students in a distance learning model, if that's what they're offering, that have more than, I believe it's either 3 or 5 absences, and what that re-engagement looks like in a distance learning model. There are some school districts that did a great job of re-engaging students and locating and working with their students who had a hard time accessing distance learning. And there are some that really struggled with it. And our hope is that during the summer period, that administrators are really working together to identify best practices that they can use that will be the most helpful for identifying which students are at risk of kind of falling through the cracks before school starts again.
Hey, Erin, I want to put this question to you first. This is coming in from our viewer, Corey Brown, and he's asking specifically, any more information on childcare for educators and school employees during this hybrid model or distance learning model?
That's such a great question that I think is on every single working parent's mind during this time. And with due disclosure, as a working parent myself of 2 public school students, I know we are all incredibly concerned about what to do about childcare. As we know, affordable childcare was a crisis before the pandemic started, and we've already seen just an absolute crisis begin with the closure of many private childcare centers that essential workers across not just education, but all essential fields had relied upon in order for them to go to work every day. And so we're hearing from a lot of parents great concern about not knowing where they're going to be able to take their children when they go back to work this fall. And then also incredible concern from parents based off of the hard decisions LEAs are going to have to make around potential hybrid instruction environments in order to have safe cohorts and ratios. What does that mean for the rest of the workday? So we made a good first step in the Budget Act. We were able to put out another $350 million in support that we received from the federal government for childcare to support both the infrastructure and keep childcare systems afloat that currently exist, but also increasing access for essential workers. We were also able to then earmark more money if we get future federal aid for about another $150 million in childcare support. We know that's a drop in the bucket. We really are hoping that LEAs will work with us to be a part of this solution. The childcare crisis is going to continue to be a huge driver during this pandemic. And whether LEAs are needing to take advantage of the minimum day minute requirements, whether they're going to stagger days, childcare for both workers and for parents is going to be a big piece of this. And we're really hoping that individual school leaders will make sure it's part of their solution.
Jessica, one of our viewers, Christine, references a concern that we've heard that I think as parents or as the educators that everybody would prefer to have in-person instruction as being the default, given that it's the best thing for kids, but that there is some concerns about just given the amount of teachers, of educators that are going to be health vulnerable just because of unique health situations. Are we going to have the workforce to be able to offer that? Any thoughts on just some of those considerations as we went through this process and came with the final deal?
That's an excellent point. And I was not clear before when discussing health and safety. Health and safety is not just about our kids. It's also about the people who work in education. It's about our administrators and our teachers, our classified staff. All those folks are so crucial. I believe the question, part of the question was about whether or not we have assessed how many teachers are vulnerable, and we don't have great numbers about on that at the state level. We have some information about the age of teachers, but we don't have a great sense of pre-existing health conditions. So from a state level, it's difficult. But I've heard from many administrators of school districts across the state who have given me, a variety of percentages: 10%, 20% of my staff are vulnerable to COVID-19. And so when we talk about creating a plan that works for your district and that protects health and safety, that includes your staff. And we also understand that many administrators across the state are working with their collective bargaining units to develop plans for those teachers who have a pre-existing condition, are above the age guidelines provided by their local or state public health officer, in order to ensure that they can continue to work, but also not put themselves at additional risk. And I would also note that the state has also provided quite a bit of PPE, so personal protective equipment, safety equipment, to school districts across the state to help ensure that regardless of a staff person's health risks, they have access to those materials they need to stay safe in the classroom.
All right, here we go. Last question as we cross the bottom of the hour here. I know you guys are probably part of that group that spends a lot of time in the Capitol and these legislative hearings and these committee hearings. And so I know, and Edgar and I have talked about this before, there's got to be some way you stay alert during these meetings. So Erin, let's go ahead and start with you. How do you stay alert during these meetings? And then Jessica, right after.
Well, I have to say the world has changed quite a bit, the world of phones. And so one of my favorite things to do when I'm rarely bored, because of course all of our hearings are riveting. When I'm rarely bored, I'm a nerd and I continue to check my email, but maybe I get to some of my kids' teachers' emails.
Okay. All right.
Very productive.
Seriously, very productive.
Yeah.
Jessica, you're next, and I'm going to make an assumption here that you are not taking any of the education code books that you have on your bookshelf behind you out to the Capitol for these hearings.
No, I'm not. That would be a good workout if I did. I try to stay alert, and we're not supposed to bring drinks or food into the committee room. But I have to admit, I've gotten pretty good at sneaking in my Starbucks to help keep alert during long meetings. So that's my secret. And Erin, please don't rat me out.
All right, Jessica Holmes, Erin, Gabel, thank you guys so much for being with us today. Great conversation, great information. I know our members appreciated it. So thanks so much for being with us today.
Well, thank you.
I know that Edgar will absolutely sell me out here for all of our viewers, but I know that during our meetings where he and I are both in them, Edgar, I know you've caught me falling asleep at least one time.
Yeah, maybe once or twice. It's tough, right? Long meetings. So you're a trooper there. You be able to power through most of the time.
The funny part is that Edgar and I never sit on the same side of the table, and I think that's a good thing. Because if he needed to, he could at least, kick me under the table or something like that, just to keep me going. Folks, thanks so much for being with us. We're not on the air next Wednesday. I'm allegedly going to take a vacation day, which means, Edgar, I'm rebuilding a deck and I'm building 2 chicken coops at the house. So when we come back the following week, I'll either have pictures or a lot of scars all over my face.
Sounds like you're going to be productive next week.
We'll see what happens. Edgar, good seeing you. We'll see you in a couple of weeks. Have a good rest of the day and rest of the week.
Be safe, Naj. Good seeing you.
Thank you. Thank you, folks, very much for being with us today on the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break. Again, we'll see you not next Wednesday, but the following Wednesday right here on ACSA Facebook and ACSA YouTube. Have a great day.